Alright, welcome back to another Philosophy Roulette. I think we're at number 32, but I've been known to mess that up before. Where we grab just any old philosophy paper off the interwebs, and then you get my reaction to it. So, we just did ways of thinking about ways of being this morning. And now, oh that's right, I want to do a network of feeling perception, but this one is unavailable, isn't it? That is so sad. Boo. So, yeah, this is not no open access, nothing. Why should we let people read the research people do for that have already been paid for? That's crazy. Critical notes of epistemic consequences. Did I do recent work on physicalism? This is a review. I think I said I didn't want to bother with a review. What am I complaining about? Let's do it! Uh-oh. Oh, maybe this is it. It's a docx. Oh, I have it set. Oh, I don't know if it'll work. Let's try it, though, this time. I did get it set up to do a docx, or a document, so let's find out. Try. Okay, that looks like we are up and running. Good. Let's see, I can hide the, well, see if I can take off some of the, toolbars. Oh. Alright, I'll worry about that later. But yeah, this is good enough for now. That's a little, is that too big? Or is that, alright, that'll do. That will do. Okay, so, recent work on physicalism. As a first pass, physicalism is the doctrine that there is nothing over and above the physical. Much recent philosophical work has been devoted to spelling out what this means in more rigorous terms. Oh, excuse me, let me drop the link in the chat before we get anywhere else. So, if you are watching, you can then type exclamation point paper, and that will bring up this link to this page here where you can just download it right there. So, okie dokie, good. And we're off. Oh no, what did I just do? Oh, okay. And that's what happens when you try to change things live. You do not know what's going to happen, even as much as you think you know what's going to happen. Yeah, like the box here is out of order, but that doesn't matter. What follows is a survey of such work. I begin by looking at competing accounts of what is meant by nothing over and above in section 1, and then turn to how the physical should be understood in section 2. Once we are clear on the options for formulating the physicalist theories, we'll look at leading defense of the view, section 3. Along the way, I will suggest avenues for further exploration. Nothing over and above. Okay. The primary motivation for including the nothing over and above clause in the statement of physicalism is the thought that physicalism should be consistent with the existence of entities not on their face physical, even entities that are irreducible to physical entities in some important sense, provided they depend on and are determined by physical entities in the right way. Indeed, non-reductive physicalism is plausibly the leading version of physicalism today, with contemporary authors still frequently referring back to classic defenses like Putnam, Davidson, and Fodor. To be sure, the position has its critics like Kim and Polger and Shapiro, but we should not want the definition of physicalism to rule out the view prior to substantive argument, and so the question is how to make sense of nothing over and above in a way that allows for such non-reductive but nevertheless physicalist views. Supervenience. Woo, supervenience. For years, the standard response to this question appealed to supervenience. All these people talked about that. Here's one example of how to develop a supervenience-based formulation of physicalism due to Jackson. Supervenience is: physicalism is true just in case any logically possible world that is a minimal physical duplicate of the actual world is a duplicate simplicator of the actual world. A minimal physical duplicate of the world, W, is a world that is physically indiscernible from W, and that contains nothing more than what it needs to by virtue of being physically indiscernible. So, for instance, no Cartesian souls or ghosts or ectoplasm if W lacks them. To see why such an approach seems promising, consider two different views about phenomenal consciousness. First, a standard role functionalist view holds that consciousness properties are not identical with physical properties, but instead are second-tier functional properties that supervene on physical properties with logical necessity. Such a role functionalist quantifies as a physicalist according to supervenience. The functional properties she posits are not physical, but they are nothing over and above the physical properties since they supervene. In contrast, property dualists like Jackson and Chalmers hold that consciousness properties do not supervene on physical properties with logical necessity, and so are classified as rejecting physicalism according to supervenience. We are getting the right results. Okay. Yeah, this is a survey, so we're just surveying these things. That sounds like the gloss I've heard before too. It is generally agreed that the supervenience of everything on the physical is a necessary condition for physicalism, although see Montero 2013 for an argument to the contrary. The debate has focused instead on whether it is also sufficient. One especially influential argument is that it is not maintains that what physicalism requires is not just such supervenience, but in addition that the obtaining supervenience relations be explained in a physicalistically acceptable way rather than brute. Yeah. You gotta love the neologisms that philosophers love to make up. Two examples are often used to illustrate the idea. First, Moore's 1903 metaethical non-naturalism takes moral properties to supervene on natural properties. We can suppose physical properties with an apparent logical necessity, and yet surely the view is inconsistent with physicalism. Horgan in 93 and 2006 discusses the case at length, but also see Polger 13, who contends that while Moore's non-natural properties are physicalistically unacceptable, his brute supervenience relations are not. So you got the relation right, not the naturalism right. Alright. Well, it was 1903. Second, classic emergentist views of mind, McLaughlin 92, perhaps especially if combined with necessitarian view, a necessitarian view of laws, are paradigmatically anti-physicalist. You know what? Where's the word count? No automatic spell checking. With the necessitarian view of laws are paradigmatically anti-physicalist, and yet take, or at least can take, mental properties to supervene on physical properties with metaphysical necessity. Excuse me. Let's see Howell, who defends the supervenience approach from this putative counterexample. In response to this line of criticism, several philosophers in recent years have sought some stronger and more explanatory relation than supervenience in order to analyze nothing over and above. A priori entailment. One option to consider here is a priori entailment. In the relevant sense of entailment, one class of truths entails another just in case any logically possible world in which the first class obtained, the second class obtains. An entailment is said to be a priori if it is knowable a priori. Here is a proposal. A priori entailment. Physicalism is true just in case the class of all actual physical truths taken with a totality of truth a priori entail all truths. Okay, so given all of the physical stuff, you can figure out all the other truths ever. Okay. This would rule out the emergentist scenario considered above. Even if the physical truths entail emergent mental truths, in the given sense of entailment, such entailments are not knowable a priori. Okay. The response to this sort of proposal is the opposite of what we saw with supervenience. It is not much disputed that such a pattern of a priori entailment would be sufficient for the truth of physicalism, but many deny it is necessary. In particular, there are so-called a posteriori physicalists who grant that the physical truths entail all the truths, but maintain that such entailments are knowable only a posteriori. For instance, see Bloch and Stalnaker, McLaughlin, Diaz-Leon, and El Pidoru. The view is often motivated by reflecting on certain epistemic arguments against physicalism. So, for instance, a posteriori physicalists typically respond to Chalmers' conceivability argument by maintaining that the proposition that there are zombies, beings physically indiscernible from us but lacking phenomenal consciousness, is conceivable but impossible. Where a proposition is conceivable just in case its negation is not knowable a priori. Where they respond to Jackson's knowledge argument by conceding that comprehensive knowledge of physical truths would not itself position one to infer phenomenal truths, while denying that this epistemic point supports dualism or otherwise has any metaphysical import. Okay, yeah, I see the point of the a posteriori physicalists. It's like, yeah, maybe if we actually were able to know such things, then we could figure out everything, but we're never going to know such things, so maybe we can only do it after the fact, and then we can figure it out. But then there's a question of exactly what it means after the fact, what the epistemic after the fact actually comes to. I mean, it's not... It might seem obvious at first, but the more I think about it, the more you might think about it, it may not be what actually counts as after the fact in the relevant epistemic sense. It's so easy to understand. So, okay. Some philosophers deny the tenability of a posteriori physicalism. For discussions of the issues involved, see for instance Jack. This whole list of people. Without trying to settle the debate here, the following seems prima facie possible. Even if you think a posteriori physicalism is ultimately untenable, there is something to be established through substantive argument not built into the definition of physicalism. Indeed, since physicalism is a metaphysical rather than epistemological thesis, any attempt to analyze it in its epistemic terms like a priori knowability is on the wrong path. Perhaps the correct metaphysical analysis of nothing over and above will have epistemic implications, including implications for a priori entailment. But even if this is so, the analysis itself should be purely metaphysical. Yeah, so maybe us thinking about what we know is not the right way to get at the heart of the matter here. Okay. Realization. Let's see, how many pages? I got a bunch of ways to go. Okay. So consider another alternative. Several philosophers have responded to the perceived failures of supervenience-based analyses of nothing over and above by turning to the notion of realization, familiar from discussions of functionalism and multiple realization. Competing accounts of realization have been developed. Melnick, 03, understands realization in terms of functional types. A type F is functional when it is associated with some condition C, such that necessarily F is tokened, just in case there is some token of a type G that meets C. Okay. When this occurs, the G token is said to realize the F token. With this account of realization in place, Melnick proposes something close to the following. Realization. Physicalism is true just in case every entity is either physical or realized by a physical entity. Alternatively, realization can be understood using the subset account of realization developed in a different way by Wilson, Shoemaker, Clapp, and Watkins. Here the core idea is that one property or perhaps property instance realizes another just in case the causal powers of the realizee are a proper set of those of the realizer. Okay, so yeah, you've got some causal chain here, which is different than the entailment above, and different from the supervenience, which means it was just one can't change without the one, whatever the physical stuff is underneath. If there's any change above, there has to be some sort of physical change underneath. Then the entailment was the logic of it, and this one is sort of a causal account of. This is the causal account here. So, what happened there? Oh dearie, dearie. Okay. What the heck? Oh, I don't like that. I don't like that at all. Why can't I highlight? Okay. I somehow got on the dump ink icon. I don't know how that happened. Okay, so we've gone through 3 different sorts of notions of how one thing can depend on another, basically, here. I mean, there's grounding, of course, is supervenience 2.0. We might get to that later. Okay, yet others realize the realization have been developed by other authors. See, for instance, Gillette, Endicott, Poljar, and Shapiro. Not all recent work on realization explicitly engages the question of how to formulate physicalism. However, I want to allow that some views may fall outside the scope of our discussion here. Well, of course. I mean, physical realized, so it's like causally or it somehow comes together in this realization. That's what this does. The realizationists analyze nothing over and above, has several things going for it. Realization relations seem to entail that and explain why supervenes relations still obtain, because that's how it gets realized. The supervene is through the realization. It's like the method of how supervenes is actually function. In connection, the approach seems to properly handle a non-naturalism and emergentism case that pose a problem for supervenience, and all the leading accounts that treat realization as a purely metaphysical relation, thus avoiding some sort of epistemic intrusion we saw with a priori entailment. Before we get too pleased with ourselves for having settled a philosophical question, let us consider our 4th and final view, and there is the big bad grounding, as I just mentioned, because that's what everyone... If you've been watching this, you'll see there's a bunch of papers on grounding we've been talking about, and they're just all of... It's a popular topic nowadays. Contemporary metaphysics is in the midst of a grounding revolution, marked by an intense interest in the form of metaphysical dependence that obtains between the comparatively fundamental and derivative when the latter obtains in virtue of the former obtaining. Fine, Schaffer, Rosen, Audi, Clark, and Liggins, Dasgupta, Elpidopoulos, forthcoming. Grounding is often taken to be metaphysically primitive, in which case no analysis is available. But authors advance claims about its formal features. For example, perhaps it should be understood as an irreflexive, asymmetric, transitive, hyper-intentional relation that can obtain between entities of any sort. And paradigmatic examples are given. In Fine's famous case, the existence of Socrates ground the existence of the singleton set Socrates, but not vice versa. This is the second time I've read this example in like in the last day or two, because it's people read grounding and they also this is what people talk about now, and they mention Fine. Several authors have regarded the formulation of physicalism as an obvious place where grounding might be put to work, so consider grounding. Physicalism is true just in case every entity is either physical or grounded in physical entities. Now grounding champions are often explicit about their reason for preferring their approach to supervenience or a priori entailment, but what about realization? Yeah, I mean, realization might allow for more things than just this grounding relation. It might be able to realize through grounding or realize through other ways. Here, such philosophers have not yet said enough. Indeed, they often say nothing at all about the realizationist view. Is realization simply grounding by another name, or perhaps a determinate form of grounding? I was just thinking it was the other way around. Grounding might be a form of realization. But yeah, that's what the author said here is probably. I can almost guarantee you that's better. I will guarantee you that's better. One reason to think that is not One reason to think not is that while grounding is primitive, leading accounts take realization to be analyzable. For instance, on the subset account can be typo on the subset. This take off the on. The subset and the subset account can be analyzed in terms of causal powers and sets thereof. If grounding and realization are competitors, this point presumably counts as an advantage of the realizationist approach. Other things being equal, we should prefer a formulation of physicalism that does not require new primitives. Okay, because it's just using causal subsets, I guess? Yeah, the subset account. Yeah, causal subsets. And so, yeah, so that's what this is actually what I was thinking earlier, is that just because it could be, you can do grounding in terms of subsets too, even though I've seen people argue that, I think, before. Perhaps that's wrong, so I'm not an expert in grounding, so do not be taking my word for anything about grounding. But yeah, I guess this is a very good point that these are two, grounding and realization are not particularly, have the difference has not been spelled out yet. In addition, as Wilson and Melnick both observe, it's not clear that grounding properly handles the cases that motivate the initial rejection of supervenience. For example, Rosen proposes that a Morean can take non-natural moral facts should be grounded in natural, suppose physical facts. Even aside from Rosen's specific view, it seems correct that in some cases of the vague phrase, the Morean can agree that non-natural moral facts hold in virtue of natural physical facts. But if the Morean can accept such grounding claims, grounding fails an analysis of physicalism. Okay, because it would just be assumed, I guess. It's not an analysis. Let me just see if that what I just said is right. So if non-natural moral facts hold in virtue of that, but then it accepts such grounding that fails an analysis of physicalism. Okay. Not 100% sure I understand this, but yeah, I think it just would mean you're not explaining things at that point. Okay. Cutting in the opposite direction, you might suspect that realizationist approach can come with metaphysical commitment that grounding theorists are able to avoid. For example, some have thought the subset account requires an objectionable view of properties and powers. See McLaughlin, Baltimore, Morris, Pineda, and Vicente. And you might doubt that mental or higher order types can be functionally defined in the way Melnick's account requires. At any rate, the realization-grounding divide seems like a promising avenue for further exploration in the years ahead. For now, perhaps the thing to say is philosophers have made progress on analyzing nothing over and above, without yet settling on a universally accepted approach. Yeah, I guess the thing is, where do you want to do your analysis? If you want to work with something that is like at the ground level, as it were, that's grounding, because it's supposed to be a fundamental thing, blah blah blah. And if you want to work with something that's analyzable, you do it via realization. But it's like it seems like two sides of the same coin in some sense. You're taking one thing and holding it steady to analyze this physicalism, or you're taking something that can be changed and then seeing how physicalism can be fit. You're holding grounding steady and seek how physicalism fits into it, or you are kind of taking you're changing you're holding physicalism steady and you're seeing how seeing how physicalists can be understood through the realization account. But there's some wiggle room there. So if you want wiggle room, you go realization. If you want to sort of get a like more axiomatic approach, where you're just starting with something that you can't move, then you go grounding. So it might just be a temperamental thing. The physical. Now consider the other portion of the physicalist slogan that there is nothing over and above the physical, just what is meant by the physical. This is a great question and does not get asked often enough. The theory view. The natural place to start is with the theory view. It says the physical should be understood in terms of the theories of the science of physics. Here is one way to develop this thought, by drinking beer. Excuse me. That is not the way to develop any thought. An entity is physical just in case it is denoted by a theoretical term of physics. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm going to define something to be a theoretical term of physics then it makes it physical. For instance, mass, charge, angular momentum, and so on all count as physical entities according to theory. The theory view is perhaps the most common approach to defining the physical. See all these people here. But the position faces a challenge posed by Hempel's dilemma. Carl Hempel. The dilemma concerns just how physics is to be understood in theory. If it is taken to mean current physics, the resulting physicalist doctrine is likely false, since current physics is presumably incomplete. Okay, so we've got a pessimistic induction going on here. But if it is taken to mean some future or ideal physics, the resulting physicalist doctrine is empty, since nobody knows what a future or ideal physics might contain. Yeah, so because so if you're going to try to understand the physical in terms of a theory, well, theories are things that grow and change over time, and so there's no stable target for this. And so if there's no stable target, then you can have trouble having a good understanding what physics is actually coming. The physicalist is talking about if they're just referring to physics, because physics is mostly it's a changing, adapting subject like everything else in the world. I mean, a lot of work in the philosophy of science to actually pin down what stays stable in physics, and so I'm sure this would appeal to that, or the authors that are interested in this would appeal to that. But even so, that's not even nowhere near settled. I've tried to work on this before. What actually is somewhat settled in science. Some authors have taken the dilemma, or broadly similar considerations, to pose an insuperable challenge for physicalism, showing that there is no interesting and plausibly true physicalist thesis to be had. Crane and Mellner, Chomsky, and the discussion in Montero. Some embrace the dilemma's first run, maintaining that current physics is the way to proceed. Some embrace the second, arguing that the appeal to a future ideal physics need not be empty. And some say physicalism needs to be reconceived as a stance or attitude rather than hypothesis. Van Frost and Ney. That might be interesting to look at. Physicalism as a stance or attitude. Something to think about there. Because what would that actually mean to have a physicalist stance? It'd just be a normative thing then. Physicalism as a normative theory, not as a metaphysical theory of what exists in the world, or an ontology really, but as something that we should be aspiring to. Instead of examining any of these options at length or assessing their merits, I want to focus on another potential response to the dilemma, rejecting theory in favor of an alternate conception of the physical. Okay, the via negativa view. One way to bypass Hempel's dilemma is by dropping the reference to physics and instead finding the physical in terms of what it is not, where the idea especially is that the physical is not mental. Okay. Spurt and Papineau, Spurt, Montero, and Papineau, Wilson, Worley, Tiehen. You know, I was going to go see David Papineau give a talk here in New York, and I can't because it's coronavirus shut down the talk that I was going to go see him talk at. That made me sad, because it seemed like a good talk. It was on probability, I believe. Yes, I really hope he gives a talk later, but he goes back to England in the fall, I believe, so I will probably not see him, and that makes me sad. Here's an initial attempt to formulate such a via negativa view. An entity is physical just in case it is not mental. Wow. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure about this via negativa thing. This pleasingly straightforward proposal does not work, however. I was like, yeah, it's straightforward, but that just usually, if it's that easy, it's usually just wrong. It's nothing that easy. You don't get nothing that easy. Definitely not in philosophy. When there's something that easy, I can just guarantee you there's like 4 billion ways it can go wrong. For one thing, it mishandles the threat to physicalism posed by non-mental entities. For instance, Moore's non-natural moral properties are not mental and so are classified as physical. The wrong result. Yeah, so what happened to moral stuff? Another, as in Stoliar observes, the proposal mishandles psychological entity theories. Such theories say that certain entities, properties, events are both mental and physical. But on via negativa, this amounts to saying those entities are both mental and not mental, a contradiction. Perhaps such identity theories are objectionable, but surely their incoherence cannot be established this easily. You know, of course, this could actually be right in the entire world, but like it would just be this would be extremely hard to show. So if you're gonna believe something along this sort of line, oh god, no more. Wow, I wonder what is wrong with this thing. Am I like clicking too many times? I don't understand that. All right, so I can't highlight. Is there like an underline here? Let's see what happens if I hit Control U. Okay, if you're gonna do something like this, I don't like that. I mean, if you're gonna hold something like this, you just have to know you're in for a lot of pain, even if you are right, because it's just too easy when something's this simple to find counterexamples. So it's something to think about when looking at philosophy. If it's too good to be true, it usually is. Maybe the thing to do is move away from a formulation like via negativa and in the direction of Wilson's no fundamental mentality constraint. The rough idea is that physicalism should allow non-fundamental physical properties to be mental, but rule out the instantiation of fundamental mental properties. Tiehen develops Wilson's idea along different lines, taking a property to be physical just in case it is not fundamentally mental. Alright, then you've got a good question about fundamental and physical. How do you, where do you draw the line? Okay. So you've got two things, two ways of sorting the world out. You've got the physical way of sorting it. This is physical, and then you've got not fundamentally mental. So you've got a classifier on that. And so, I mean, I'm sure they come up with clever ways of doing this, but you're multiplied your criterion now. Before engaging in further comparison of the views, it would be helpful to have our last remaining account of the physical on the table. The object view. We possess an intuitive concept of a physical object, where paradigmatic instances include things like tables and chairs, rocks and mountains. Some philosophers have tried to draw on this concept to define the physical. These folks consider the following. Object. An entity is physical just in case it is the sort of entity that figures in a complete account of the intrinsic nature of objects like tables and chairs, rocks and mountains. That is paradigmatic physical objects. Okay, so like above over here with the fundamental, mental, here we have paradigmatic. Another way of sorting things out. It's the paradigmatic, fundamentally not mental, fundamentally physical. So we've got a modifier on physical, really, is what's going on here. Part of this object view is that it seems to be a guiding idea of physicalism that humans aren't special. Our minds are realized by or grounded in the same sorts of entities that make up tables, chairs, rocks, and mountains. Object captures this. Our minds are realized by the same... I have no idea what realized by right here, or grounded in. Like, what does that mean? That... I mean, I'm with Whitmer that humans aren't special, like in sort of like this, like under these accounts, like you can think we're special otherwise, but like under these accounts, no, I understand that, but I don't understand how exactly, okay, if it just means that we're made of like the same sorts of stuffs that these sorts of stuffs are made of, okay, but what does it have to do with our minds and like specifically our minds? Okay, I mean that we're all physical is just sort of an overarching that we're all made of the same stuff is an overarching like viewpoint of the physicalist point of view, like that there's only one thing and it's all the physical and its ways that's put together. But like I'm not exactly sure what the force of this is. My apologies for if I am being hard-headed at the moment. The object view comes with its own set of problems, however. Among them, it seems to classify non-physical various entities that are not ordinarily physical objects, but nevertheless are such that no self-described physicalist objects to them, like gravitational forces or quantum mechanical wave functions. That seems like pretty physicsy stuff to me. What would be the problem with that sort of physicsy stuff? Okay, but given limitations of space, let's focus on how it interacts with a family of unconventional mind-body views that have received much attention in recent years. A family that includes panpsychism and Russellian monism, according to Chalmers, Rosenberg, Strawson, Skrbina, Alter, Nagasawa. Whether these theories are consistent with physicalism partly depends on what is meant by the physical. Okay. To illustrate, consider a view on which everything that exists is made up of the same sort of fundamental entities, and these entities all have phenomenal intrinsic natures that are inscrutable to physics. Okay, so that's what's going on here. All these things have problems for physics. Human consciousness is realized by or grounded in the intrinsic phenomenal properties of the particles that make up human bodies. Is this a physicalist position? Yes, on object. For the same entities that make up humans also make up tables and chairs, rocks and mountains. Consciousness is more prevalent than we thought, but this just underscores the point that humans aren't special with respect to consciousness. Maybe on... Okay, so yes on object because... Okay, so I see... It's an argumentative strategy is what's going on here. Since we're made up of the same stuff as the stuff around us, because the same objects around us. Again, how we classify what counts as an object is the paradigmatic thing. I don't know, maybe we're just begging the question then. But according to the stuff we normally put around us, we're made of that stuff, and it doesn't really matter how that stuff gets to be what we are made of, just as it doesn't matter how that stuff turns into a chair or a mountain or whatever. But anything part of us would just be created out of that stuff. Okay, so yes on object. Is physicalism an option given all the different sorts of possible weird theories that we come up with? Alright, so maybe on theory, depending on the further physical and semantic details. Remember, theory is the current going theory of physics or some perfect theory of physics. So maybe. Suppose the theoretical terms of physics have functional definitions, so that, for instance, electron denotes whatever property occupies the electron role. And suppose the occupants of all the given functional roles are phenomenal properties. These phenomenal properties will then qualify as physical on theory, even on the assumption that their phenomenal natures are not revealed by physics. That is, even on the assumption that the given functional definition are neutral on the intrinsic natures of the properties denoted. That said, there are other ways of spelling out the metaphysical and semantic details so that this inscrutability to physics may be incompatible with such properties qualifying as physical on the theory view, hence the maybe verdict. So yeah, maybe a physical theory depending on how you expand it in different ways and what sort of functionalist view, like, because it may not matter so much what the thing is, but if it performs a role, then it becomes a part of the physical theory. That may just be ad hoc, but that's why this is maybe, because maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, depending on how you understand theory and some of the other details. Okie dokie, that's reasonable. So are all these weird theories that we have, would they count as physicalist? The answer is no on the via negativa view that endorses Wilson's no fundamental mentality constraint. For this panpsychist view, described posits fundamental phenomenal mental properties. So because of those, all the way that mental is broken down in all those theories, you're not going to get a non-mental, because that doesn't there's too much mentality in the world, so you will lose all your physics if it's a via negativa, because the panpsychist view basically says everything's a little bit consciousness, we're just more so, and so, but if you try and take all the mentality out of the world, then there is no more world left. Some philosophers take the preceding to count in favor of the object view. They see panpsychism as opening up a promising way for physicalists to understand consciousness. Others just draw the opposite conclusion. Physicalism should be a sober, hard-headed position that rules out zaniness like panpsychism, and so what we see here is the inadequacy of object, they say. Without trying to solve this dispute, I close the section by suggesting there's room for further work on the topic involved. There's always room for further work on the topic involved. This philosophy does not die. I mean, I like this paper. It is a review, but it's kind of fun. The case for physicalism. Now that we have seen some of the options for formulating the physicalist theories, what is the case to be made for the view? While various different arguments have been advanced, the most influential is surely the causal argument for physicalism. Lewis, Davidson, Papineau, Melnick, Stoljar, don't know. We'll make it our focus here. Formulating the argument. Here is one version of the argument inspired by David Papineau. I'm assuming there's only one David Papineau. There aren't another Papineau. I don't know, but I've never seen that name before. It doesn't seem that common, so I'm just gonna assume it's David since he's alive at 2001, and maybe he has like some relatives or something. Any physical, and I apologize now if it turns out there's like a Jorge Papineau and not David Papineau. Any physical event that has a cause at time t has a sufficient physical cause at t. The physical events of mental causes are not all causally overdetermined. All mental events have physical effects. Therefore, mental events are identical with physical event. Physical events. Mental events are identical with physical events. The idea mental events must be physical if they are to causally interact with the physical world in the way we think they do. Sure. Like I was arguing before, the pineal gland. Don't we know our 17th century biology anymore? We need to talk about the pineal gland. This particular formulation focuses on mentality, but the argument can be straightforwardly extended to apply to chemistry, biology, or any other domain taken to have physical effects. It cannot be extended to putatively non-causal realms, however. So if instances of Moore's non-natural moral properties are not meant to be causes, because they concern only how things ought to be, not how they are, suppose the causal argument has no purchase on them. Papineau endorses this result, taking it to reflect a proper limit on the ambitions of physicalism, but other philosophers, including those who reject supervenience, at least partly because it mishandles non-naturalism, will be dissatisfied with this. Perhaps they can supplement the causal argument and reject Morean non-naturalism on some other grounds. Non-reductive physicalism and mental causation. The causal argument's conclusion that mental events are identical with physical events entails that mental properties are identical with physical properties if we hold with Kim that events just are property exemplifications. Papineau welcomes this reductionist result, as would Kim. But it raises the question of whether non-reductive physicalists can endorse some version of the causal argument without undermining their own view. Perhaps the causal considerations at play here don't speak just in favor of physicalism generally, but support a reductive form of physicalism more specifically. There is a mountain of work by non-reductive physicalists attempting to show that this is not so. See Gibb for a survey covering much of it. But just to get a sense of the challenges in the area, see Judish and O'Connor and Churchill, who flipped the familiar narrative by arguing that causal considerations ultimately support anti-physicalist views by ruling out the most attractive, non-reductive version of physicalism. And see Stolyar and List, who contend that dualists can co-opt the most promising non-reductive physicalist account of mental causation, thereby blocking the causal argument against their own view. So, is there anything... Okay, whatever. I mean, yeah, so if you start futzing with what counts as events and properties, you run into problems. That's fine, depending on how you slice the world up. Empirical defenses of causal closure. There are overdeterminationists who reject P2 on the causal argument, and epiphenomenalists who reject P3. Let's focus on the causal closure premise P1. Why accept it? The most influential defenses are empirical. I reject causal closure usually. Let's go see what they said earlier. We're on page 11. Okay. I want to go take a look at P1. Where's P1 here? P1, any physical that has times T has sufficient causity. Okay. Now, if you're a physicalist, you already believe there's closure here. I don't believe in causal closure on the metaphysical level, so if you're going to put on your physicalist's hat, then you kind of have to accept causal closure for P1. I would put it on for the sake of these arguments. I do not hold it in general, though. Yeah, I regard causal closure as a dogmatic. It's mostly held for dogmatic reasons and no other ones. Yeah. So indeed it is here that for many philosophers, physicalism stakes its claim to being better supported by science than its competitors. I say it's more dogmatic than its competitors. One empirical line of argument in favor of causal closure appeals to the conservation laws of physics. Papineau, Vicente, Montero, Coxvick, Gibb. The idea, roughly, is that causing a physical effect involves changing the energy or momentum or some other conserved quantity in some physical entity. but non-physical entities cannot possess or therefore transfer such physical quantities. Therefore, non-physical to mental causation would require the violation of some of our best confirmed scientific laws. I said 17th century biology. Why does everyone ignore it? Papineau also advances a second distinct physiological argument. If there were non-physical causes operating in violation of causal closure, we would expect this to occur in the human body. After all, it was here that non-physical minds would intervene. But biology, neurosciences, and aligned fields find no evidence of such violations. This gives us broadly inductive reason to accept causal closure. Broadly inductive. What exactly counts as broadly inductive, my friends? I don't know. I'm sure people say stuff, but I don't usually, I have questions about that argument there. But I don't think you should, but I do. How one understands the physical seems relevant to how these arguments are to be taken. For instance, it is easy enough to see how a defense of causal closure based purely on the conservation laws might work with the theory view of the physical. Causal based on conservation. Yeah, because if you're going to do a theory view of the physical, then the causal closure just is that view has causal closure. But a challenge arises if you try to combine theory view with the physiological argument, since it is not completely uncontroversial that physiological entities are nothing over and above those described by physics. Papineau gets around this by endorsing of the view of the via negativa view. Okay, so yeah, because how do you slide the mental in there then? Or consider what is the evidence that the domain of tables and chairs, rocks, mountains, and other entities similar to such objects is causally closed. The answer is at least not immediately obvious. Okay. Yeah. Again, how you define the physical. Really, a lot turns on what do you mean by the physical. Causal argument skepticism. The causal argument, taken together with some sort of empirical defense of causal closure, is again the most influential defense of physicalism today. Yeah, I'd agree. That's a sociological fact. It seems to be how I think I've seen people talk. But this defense also has its critics. Montero maintains that physical conservation laws are irrelevant to mental causation. Bishop contends the argument is question begging, relying on a hidden premise tantamount to physicalism itself. Yes, might be. I should look up Bishop. I think it's dogmatic. Tiehen advances the distinct but related claim that while we have good reason to accept causal closure, they depend on our prior reasons to accept physicalism itself. Yeah, this is also probably close to what I think. So it cannot be used to support the causal argument. Yeah, so, okay, there's probably some good things to read here. Ney argues there's a tension between endorsing the causal argument and holding, as Papineau and many other philosophers do, that there is no causation in fundamental physics. Okay. And so the debate goes on. To end on an optimistic note, causation has been the topic of a great deal of highly sophisticated philosophical and scientific work over the last few years, and since the beginning of time. As philosophers come to understand causation better and better, perhaps they will be able to get clearer and clearer on the extent to which causal considerations either do or do not support the case for physicalism. You see, I find this funny. This is like causation's been around for a long time, exactly understanding how things cause one thing causes another, and so the idea that we should be optimistic about it. If you think in the last few years it's been especially good, sure, then maybe you think we're making progress. If you take the long metaphysical view of these things, then there is no reason to think we're going to solve anything like this anytime soon. So again, maybe a question of temperament. Alright, so that was a fun review paper. Haven't seen too many review papers, but they're fun. They're more fun than I realized. Yeah. So look at all these references. Wow. It's great. So many references. Not a whole lot to say. Like I said before, there was a few little issues with how we are understanding the different theories, like when you bring in words like fundamental or paradigmatic, and then understanding the concept of the physical itself. So, because these might be competing concepts, if you're looking at paradigmatic things and then defining the physical in terms of them, or are you defining the physical first and then understanding the paradigmatic in terms of that? I mean, I think that some of these complaints recently were just so it was mentioned some of these things in here, but these are related stuff. Okay, so thanks for watching. Again, if you are watching later on the YouTubes, the link for this paper will be in the description below, and I'll be back. You know what, I might do another one, so I might be back in about 5 minutes. I'll throw a be right back. But thanks for watching, and leave me a note if you want me to review something or have any suggestions on the show. Alright, be back in a few minutes.